Welcome to the Growing Tall Poppies podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nat Green, and I'm so excited to have you join me as we discuss what it means to navigate your way through post-traumatic growth and not just survive, but to thrive after trauma. Through our podcast, we will explore ways for you to create a life filled with greater purpose, self-awareness, and a deep inner peace. Through integrating the many years of knowledge and professional experience, as well as the wisdom of those who have experienced trauma firsthand, we will combine psychology, accelerated approaches, coaching, and personal experience to assist you to learn, to grow, and to thrive. I hope to empower you to create deeper awareness and understanding and stronger connections with yourself and with others, whilst also paving the way for those who have experienced trauma and adversity to reduce their suffering and become the very best versions of themselves in order to thrive. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. I'm really pleased and grateful today to bring you our next guest on the Growing Tall Poppies podcast. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome a lovely man who I met recently through an event for podcasters, and he has experienced and overcome considerable trauma and adversity throughout his life and has so generously agreed to come and chat with us today about his experience. So let me start by introducing Mark to you all. Dr. Mark Seton is an honorary research associate in the discipline of theatre and performance studies with the University of Sydney, Australia. He's also an educator and consultant for Sense Connexion, which he established to empower open-hearted professionals such as actors, lawyers, and health practitioners whose capacity for empathy and sensitivity is crucial to their effectiveness and success. He was amazingly awarded a Churchill Fellowship in 2009 to conduct a study tour of actor training healthcare practices in the UK. Arising from this study, the Equity Foundation, in collaboration with the University of Sydney, initiated an internationally groundbreaking actors' wellbeing study in 2013. And Mark is a founding member of the Australian Society for Performing Arts Healthcare, a board member on the International Performing Arts Medicine Association, and chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee of the Australian University of Theology. So that's quite a broad range of things there, Mark. So welcome. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Natalie, and delightful to first meet you at the podcast and now to share this longer conversation. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. And as I said, it's a delight for me to have you here. So can we start? I know I gave a bit of an introduction, but can we start with you giving us a brief introduction of who you are and what you do in the world these days?
Yes, and I like the way you frame that, because who I am, I feel I'm constantly becoming more of myself, celebrating my uniqueness. The things I do, as you've already indicated, in the area of education, I do teaching of actors, particularly in areas of wellbeing, but I also look at things like history of theatre and history of screen production, those sorts of areas. But I have a growing interest in researching and advocating for the well-being not only of creatives, who often are subject to sacrificing themselves for their art, but I've noticed through my engagement with people like lawyers through the Law Wellness Network over the last 12 or so years, they too struggle to find that balance of being connected to others, empathetic with others, and yet also having those healthy boundaries. And also they encounter vicarious trauma. And so I felt this growing connection between myself and other professionals who maybe have encountered trauma or by necessity are working with people who have been traumatized, bring my own life journey of trauma and then the ways I've found resilience through my own vulnerability. That's what really drives me now, as I want to provide more and more of that insight and service to professionals in that area.
Oh, I love this so much. And you touched on so many things that are of huge interest to me. And as you know, I've pivoted a little of late, and we're really looking at what I think, and you've beautifully articulated, is a growing need to recognize the vicarious trauma that we often aren't speaking about. That when you are in a role where you're helping people and giving so much of yourself to others, as you've done for so long, and the people we work with have done, I firmly believe that vicarious trauma is such a huge thing that is often underplayed, downplayed, or just completely ignored, and we don't speak about it. So I'm excited for this
Mm.
conversation.
Indeed. And I might add, I just love the way you've framed it in terms of roles, and hence why my beginnings, this area in the area of acting. So actors take on roles,
Yep.
roles that have encountered trauma. So that the body doesn't know the difference between fiction and reality. And so actors playing out traumatizing roles become traumatized. And
Oh,
often this
yes.
has not been appreciated. In fact, I wanted to provoke more discussion in the theatrical world. So I created a term post-dramatic stress as
I
my
love that.
provocation to say there's post-traumatic stress, which sadly has not been taken seriously in the past. You know, it used to be identified after World War One as just an issue of some, people who just weren't up to being effective soldiers rather than
Yes.
recognize them as human beings. And
Mm.
just as it's been really hard to support people who experience either trauma directly or vicariously via witnessing others' traumatization. It's been hard to advocate for that because it wasn't taken seriously. And so I wanted to say, I reckon it's also happening with actors as well. And we need to do more research into that area. And that fortunately has been done now. And there's now a whole emerging conversation and practical tools to help actors prepare for traumatic roles and then debrief from those roles and de-stress from those roles as well. So, yeah, the whole notion of vicarious trauma, taking on a role, letting go of a role, this is what I'm fascinated by.
What a fascinating path to navigate. Really, I hadn't even thought of that. That when you take on the role,
Mhm.
that your nervous system doesn't know the difference, doesn't know whether you are experiencing it or pretending to experience it. And all of that trauma and those experiences would absolutely be stuck in your nervous system.
And indeed, our actor wellbeing study of 2013 found that at least 40% of actors who we surveyed, we had 768 participate in the study,
Wow.
so 40% of them actively acknowledged that they'd had troubles with debriefing from traumatizing roles.
Mm.
While the other two-thirds, it's not an issue. Maybe they've never had to do a traumatic role, but for
Yeah.
those odd 40%, and that was across stage and screen production. Sometimes people say, oh, understandably, in the stage production, you're living the role for 6 weeks or maybe years if you're doing a musical theatre. Such roles as playing traumatized characters in like
Mm.
Miss Saigon or the many opera women who die at the end of operas. These, it surprised people when we put out the results that actually musical theatre has a lot of trauma in it. And you wouldn't associate musical theatre with trauma, but it's just one of the areas in which actors have difficulty in letting go and debriefing from their roles that they play.
And I guess that comes with someone who's really good at their job.
Yes.
That if a good actor will take on that whole persona, the personality, everything, fully embrace that role. So it does. It's part of then who they are and who they become. So it's so important that they learn a process or a way to separate themselves from that role and debrief at the end.
And indeed, what I've found is that actually we need to review the way in which people believe they need to create character even before the character they create might have trauma. How they create the character will determine how effectively they can let go of the character. And I
Mm.
think that's important because then when we look at other professionals, how they have trained to be an empathetic partner in support. If they've been trained in particular ways that don't allow them to let go, that's an issue as well. So it's not just about the debriefing, it's about the preparation as well. At least that's been my lived experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And then we look as well as not just someone who's taking on a role or being trained. Like I mentioned that you worked with lawyers, with actors, but helping professionals. So I know as a psychologist in a past life, my background was very much that was my role and it was very much my identity
Mm.
because I took it so seriously and I feel that I was born to make a difference and help people. And it very much became my role and my identity. But there really was not, when I'm talking 35 years ago when I was trained in that role, that there wasn't an acknowledgement of the vicarious trauma and the impact it would have. Those realizations came later. And what we often see is that people get into certain professions because they're drawn to it because
Yeah.
of that empathy and those
Yep.
character traits that they want to do something to help people and make a difference.
Yes. Yeah. Often our own woundedness from our past
Absolutely.
becomes a thing we both understand
Mm.
profoundly, but can also get still caught up in. And so
Yes.
it's that. And as you say, I think identity is a really crucial factor. If we're dependent on our role, our identity rather, being this rescuer, helper, rather than our identity being just me as a person prior to any agenda, then we get that role confusion, empathy
Mm.
confusion, and that undid me for a significant amount of time before I came to some new insights around that shift. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we spoke the other day when we were preparing for this. So would you be okay if we talk a little bit
Yeah.
now about, yeah, I'd love you to share a bit of an overview of your trauma and what has happened for you, because honestly, I think this story is so important, both what happened and the lessons you learned and how you've worked on moving forward.
Yeah, it was a relationship that I chose to become a part of that took me and my partner into a world of uncertainty and trauma and violence and many years of pain and isolation. So it's not like I was in a particular event as rather a relationship. So that's probably a way to set it up. I met a girl. I fell in love with her, and possibly part of that helper, that being
Hmm.
in tune with the pain of another, possibly was
Yes.
even happening then that I sensed something in her was troubled, in need of care and
Hmm.
empathy, ever. And I identified I was going to be the person, the hero, the savior who understood her, could care for her, could be with her. And that's how our relationship started. And gradually, yeah, we became a couple. There was an early warning sign that I was actually out of my depth in the dynamics of the relationship when I was, and I can't remember all the details, for whatever reason, I was choosing just to have a bit of a break from the relationship. It was a fairly intense relationship, and she was having trouble, and she phoned me and we spoke, and she wanted me to come over and comfort her. And I said, no, I really can't do that. And then she threatened suicide. So I went and
Mm.
spent the time with her. So
Of
that,
course. Of
yeah,
course you did,
of course
because
I did.
that's who
And
you
not,
are and what you would do
yeah,
for
and not
someone you care
knowing
about.
other strategies
Yeah.
around suicide ideation and so
Mm.
on. That just pulled me in. So that very threat of suicide, which got repeated at other points in the relationship, was one of the reasons why I could not escape this relationship that I could see was not healthy, was not
Mm.
mutually co-productive. And this is where I, only in hindsight, discovered this cycle of distress that could lead to violence was that
Mm.
whenever we had a disagreement about how we were perceiving the way things were in our attempt to form a relationship and a lifestyle ahead for the two of us as two young people with different kinds of career aspirations, we'd have those times. And then when there'd be conflict, increasingly I needed to see the world her way. And that if I had particular feelings, no, my feelings were inaccurate. They were wrong. It's her feelings that mattered. And so now, and if I dared to challenge that, then things would escalate to initially verbal violence, and then later on, within a couple of years, physical violence. And then after those moments of violence, then there'd be the kind of remorse on her part and my part in reacting. And we come back to this, what's sometimes called the honeymoon phase, where all is well between us and we can just get on with life. And peculiarly, we're the only ones who understand each other, which isolates us from family and friends who increasingly can't be with us, connect with us in the same kind of, in a healthier, interdependent way, rather than this codependency that we have now established for each other.
Yes, very much.
Oh my goodness. What a place to be in. After then we got married. We were very fortunate that I had relatively stable income for a time. And indeed, one of my jobs was caretaking university accommodation. So that while it didn't pay me, it provided accommodation. I was endeavoring to work in the creative arts. Creative arts are not the best career if you want to have a stable income. And my wife had come from a background that was far more stable. I won't identify what kind of that was, but there was clash and conflict that was not going to get easily resolved. And then gradually I was persuaded that, maybe the arts wasn't where I was going to have a secure life, a stable life for us, and that maybe I should look at an alternative career, which I started to pursue. But her health circumstances, the dynamics of the relationship made that harder and harder until eventually we lost that accommodation. And so in the last 6 to 12 months, we were effectively without a real home. Like we were bed surfing, couch surfing, bed surfing, felt like it. Couch surfing.
A lot of destabilization.
And the violence. And I was now running away from home because we've been advised by a GP that maybe one day I might hit out in defense. She would be hurt. Police would be called. It was an age 30 years ago where it was usually the man who was the perpetrator of domestic violence. In my case, it was the other way around. And there were no resources that I was aware of for men running away from domestic violence. So I was using chairs at Central Station, hotel lobbies, libraries to catch up on sleep. But I would always go back.
Can I just ask then, as you said, 30 years ago, it was not spoken about. Even domestic violence from a male to a female wasn't really spoken about. But for that reverse, for that female towards a male, was very rarely even thought that things would happen like that. So did you talk to anyone about it, or you just kept it to yourself?
So we were seeing psychologists, or psychiatrists at one point. So we were trying to get counselling along the way, and GP. So they were acknowledging the problem. They were pointing to why my partner needed to stop reacting in the way that she was reacting. But none of those things made for any long-term change. And we had friends who over the years we acquired, and at one point those friends provided a safe place for me to be for a night or so. But she was coming out to the front of the house and yelling for me to come out, and they were bringing the police to take her away. And so all of that, it was just a mess.
Yeah, it sounds it.
And so there, as you say, there were no resources, and while there was the listening ear of various counsellors, close friends, probably one of the contributors to my finally breaking free of this was seeing a counsellor, a fresh counsellor around actually vocational changes that I was
Okay.
endeavouring to make, and that person said, this isn't really what your problem is about the vocational
Mm,
changes. And somehow I think that gave me permission to share with this person things that maybe I hadn't been able to share with others. That gave me a bit of a new perspective that effectively my relationship had died. So
mm,
that was a very confronting thing for
yeah.
me, particularly as a person of faith as well. So I have a
Mm-hmm.
Christian faith, as did my partner. So
Mm-hmm.
for us to consider failure, separation, these were things very foreign to the kind of
Yeah.
church world that we had grown
Mm-hmm.
up with. So those are huge value things that I
Mm.
was now facing when I made the decision to separate.
Yeah. So let's go to that point then. So back then,
Yeah.
you finally were able to share a little bit more with someone independent who wasn't working with the two of you, who could give you that new perspective and you hadn't seen it through those
Mm.
eyes. What happened then when you recognized that and were able to make that decision to do something different?
I think there are two factors that contributed to being able to make that next move.
Mm-hmm.
One was a time just a couple of months prior to breaking away, was having a kind of a quiet moment down in a park for myself and just feeling the immensity of the burden of this responsibility and not knowing what to do, and really feeling a sense of God or higher power, however people want to
Mm-hmm.
understand that, but saying that actually I was created to be me and not to try and be someone else. That
Mm.
was very profound. So in terms of identity, you can see
Yes.
why identity is crucial. So that was a
Mm.
key unlocked, that I should enjoy and celebrate being me and not try and fit in, pretend to be someone that I wasn't. That
Yeah.
was causing me too much distress. And
Mm-hmm.
then the other thing that happened around the same time was something that I had loved many years ago, which was singing and choral work music. There was a new opportunity to learn how to teach a cappella singing,
Mm-hmm.
gospel, African American gospel singing. And I had confidence many years ago to run a choir. And so the opportunity to run a new choir, having been trained, fed my soul in the way that I hadn't experienced for the
Mm.
preceding 7 or 8 years.
How
And I
fabulous.
believe that doing something that I enjoyed that reminded me of my own self-worth, combined with owning my own identity and the inside of my relationship has died effectively, and I could start to
Mm.
grieve that.
Yes.
Those three factors gave me the power, I believe, on a Wednesday morning when my partner and I were just heading away from one meeting, and she said, we need to now go and see the doctor and get a fresh new start on it. And I thought, here we go again. This is the
Mm.
cycle.
Yep.
She went through the gates of a railway station. I said, I'm not coming with you. And I ran
Oh,
for
wow.
my life.
How
And
brave, really.
that that was, yeah, I was hyper vigilant. Part
Oh,
of trauma is hyper vigilance.
absolutely.
By this point I was very hyper vigilant, and this was the day I actually went and found the counselor with whom I'd had these initial insights and just kind of said, this is where I'm at now, and I felt okay about that break. And
Yes.
then I contacted my parents for the
Oh.
first time to actually tell them the truth, to tell them why I had
Mm.
been this estranged son, and that they never really knew why I'd changed in my behavior, in my values, the way I had. And I went to
Mm.
stay with them. And that was the beginning of my new life. You can imagine there are post-effect complexities, but that was the turning
Mm.
point.
Wow. And really, the courage, I want to acknowledge the
Yeah.
courage that
Yeah.
took
Yep.
and that ability now to recognize, yep, your identity
Yes.
You reconnected with your values, what deep
Yes.
down was important. And it sounds like you did that through that creative part of you that hadn't been allowed to exist in the way that you naturally had all
Definitely.
your life prior to the relationship.
Yes. So all those things fed that. And then as I reflected on how did I ever get to the violent
Mm,
space, and then there was a lot of, need to deal with my tendency towards codependency, being the
yes.
hero, being the rescuer. That was a pattern that I now
Mm,
needed to consciously address in ways I'd
yes.
never done before. So that was
Mm,
ongoing part of healing and counseling support and so on. But it was a recognize now the need to have an interdependency
yes.
rather than codependency. So there's a
Mm,
lot of new learning I needed to take as I
yeah.
freed myself from this relationship.
Yeah. So when you talk about you made the decision, you ran for your life, how long was that period between that happening and when you felt that you were safe, in inverted commas, when you felt a bit safer
Mm.
to move on and be you
Yep.
and live the life you wanted? What sort of time frame was that?
It was a few years. It was a
Mm.
few years, and I think various choices I made that were about exercising my independence because I was now needing to find, I didn't have a job because I hadn't had a job. I'd been
Mm.
actually planning to train for ministry, ordained ministry
Okay.
prior to this. That was not going to work as a divorced person,
Mm.
really, in that sort of
Yeah.
scenario. So I was starting afresh, and I had when I was thinking making all these vocational changes with my partner at the time, I had put in an application for a combined arts law degree at University of New South Wales, for which I was
Okay.
accepted. So I actually had a sense of a new path,
Mm.
reconnecting with my arts foundation. So that was feeding me as well. I did
Yeah.
various short-term courses that also reaffirm my creative connectedness. And so, yes, I think it was around those things. It was then developing new friendships and indeed a new
Mm.
relationship, but now recognizing what I wasn't going to go back to. This is a meeting of equals rather than
Yes.
me being a rescuer. So learning about that and not falling into, and my new partner helping me not fall back into a codependent where I was just doing things that would please her and not, what did I want? So I would now be clear about what my needs were. I'm learning a new way of being in relationship. And that was important because for me, being resilient in my vulnerability, as I like to phrase it,
Mm.
is been a big learning over those few years and has continued. How can I have relationships again, friendships and intimate relationships again without losing my sense of self, without feeling I have to disconnect in order to be safe? I can now be safe, but I can also be open. And that's
Mm.
really important because I believe, it's through our openness that we connect with others. And so we aren't these shut off things. And while it's appropriate we have boundaries, I see them as now permeable, malleable boundaries that I can determine in relation to others. And so all of that reflection and lived experience happened
Mm.
over the few years immediately after the relationship broke off. I went and did a new degree. I'd never done a degree before, actually. So this is I was a mature age student, but this time I absolutely knew where I wanted to go with that degree. So that was in the theatre and philosophy were my two majors.
So that lived experience really fueled your new direction. And
Definitely.
I love, and you've said it a couple of times, you've used the word vulnerability. And
Mm.
I love that so much because, and this is something I see particularly in the area with helping professionals, we're very reluctant. It's almost like we have this perception that we need to be seen as strong,
Yes.
together, we can't be seen as having any issues or being human, really, that we've put ourselves on this pedestal and others often put us on that
Yes.
pedestal. And
Yes.
it's so unrealistic.
Yes.
We are human. We will make mistakes. We will live through things and hopefully learn as we do that. So tell me a bit more about that vulnerability.
So I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to own that of
Please,
me as well.
please
Yep.
do.
I love the work of Margaret Shildrick, and she wrote about vulnerability, and she talked about it's an innate part of being human. So I feel like for those who want to not be vulnerable or think that it's a bad thing, we need to get over that, because I feel scholars like Margaret Shildrick have reaffirmed the innate essence of being vulnerable. We are vulnerable as human beings. But then I have a philosopher, Rosalind Diprose, who very nicely defined vulnerability as the capacity to affect and be affected by the other. So the capacity to
Mm,
affect and be affected by the other. And you'll notice there's no value judgment there. It's not like that's a bad effect. It could be a bad effect, or it could be a good effect.
mm,
But it is just an effect. And it's effect
yes.
of my ability to affect you and others, and you or others to affect me, that creates this circuit of vulnerability. And for actors, their willingness to affect and be affected by a text is what's required in order to be vulnerable and open to play that text out. That vulnerability, and as you say, the perception that we have to, that somehow professional equals not being vulnerable or not being human,
Mm,
I see as a historical trap that we as a Western culture have fallen into, where we put human beings who happen to be trained in certain disciplines, we put them on a pedestal, perhaps to honor them, the years of work they've
mm.
done, the pay that they might attract.
Yeah.
And then we set them up for failure, because they're now no longer feeling they can be a human being. They now
Yes.
have to be this professional who can make no mistakes, who is almost above the law, and that
Yeah.
includes lawyers, and and they carry that burden of feeling they
Yes.
must do it. So that sets them up for failure,
Yes,
because
definitely.
they carry the burden and they will self-medicate to manage that
Mm-hmm.
burden through drugs, through alcohol, through
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And we feed that by elevating them. And so here we have a really unhealthy circle of codependency or
Yes.
addictive kind of qualities, rather than bringing them back down and saying they're partners with us, in healing. So it would be great for my doctor to be a human being who can partner with me in finding out what I need to do in terms of my health and well-being. They don't need to really position themselves as the person who has all the answers, because that's actually not a human being.
No.
And the way that I attempt to, when I'm doing coaching, and I can hear my client starting to elevate me, I will actively say, no, I'm just a human being like you. I just happen to have some insights that maybe will be helpful to you, and I'm delighted when they help you. And I'll make mistakes and I'll misjudge what I'm hearing you say, and I'll need to apologize, and we'll need to repair a relationship that's come a little wonky at some time. But I find it so much of a relief to remind myself and to remind others that we're all human beings working hard to make meaning together. That's another key principle of working to make meaning together. That comes from complexity theory of Ralph Stacey. So I've been living out, interweaving these values of we're innately vulnerable. Vulnerability is simply the capacity to affect and be affected by the other, which I think we all need. And in
Agreed.
fact, we're all partners in the fact that I think COVID very aptly demonstrated how vulnerable we are, because we all breathe air. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was a reminder that, yes, we are vulnerable, and to minimize vulnerability or to, I don't know, that doesn't actually add up. But we can practice self-care, permeable boundaries. In fact, at the moment, I'm researching what we as human bodies do at the cellular level, our cells are remarkably intelligent to know what to let in and what to let out.
And I
So,
think with
yeah,
that also adds weight to when you said the actors take on a role and the body gets confused. All
yes,
that is at a cellular level too, at that
absolutely.
nervous system and cellular level, that it's so easy to see how we can get confused
Yep.
and how we can actually play such a huge part in challenging that.
Yeah. And indeed, so I've now developed some practical activities to help actors how to better prepare and then debrief after taking on a traumatic role, which we may get to talk about.
Yeah,
So,
yes, definitely. And I think, as you were just saying, then I know you've got some really amazing little tricks that you're going to share with us soon.
yep.
So let's just look then. How do you think what you've been through and that experience has transformed your perspective on life, on relationships, or personal values?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's a what a rich question. I think it's transformed my life in terms of understanding relationships in a more healthy way, which others have found. I'm not the first to discover it. So, understanding the difference between codependency and in a sense autonomy and interdependency, I have really come to appreciate and value our interdependency as human beings in the world, and the Western notion of autonomy, that you can just look after yourself, has been challenged by some great feminist writers who talk about relational resilience. So I'm very excited by the work they've done and have embraced their discussion about that we actually can't even claim resilience just on our own. We need others to support us, nurture us, keep us accountable, and so on. So I think that's been profound impact on my life. I think also the work of a practice, and this actually feeds into what I'll be sharing, interplay. Now, interplay is a practice that was developed by two Americans about now, probably about 40 years ago. And I started training in that practice about 25 years ago. And it's a practice of two dancer come theologian type people who didn't quite feel at home in the church world because they didn't like dance, didn't feel quite at home at the times in the dance world because they didn't feel comfortable with religion. And they've crossed those worlds and they've brought movement and voice and song and storytelling and being playful and using these tools to help people connect with themselves and connect with each other. And so the tools that they developed and brought out to Australia, as I say, about 25 or so years ago, I discovered them at the beginning of my PhD, which was looking at the vulnerability of actors. And that was a remarkable liberation for me to really feel now embodied and connected in an even more profound way in terms of vulnerability. One of the key things that my teacher in Interplay, who's one of the co-founders, because I was a scholar, love words, love critical thinking, but she really liberated me when she said, after observing my developing skills, and this, she said, I know you love working with words, but could you dance with your words? And
Ooh.
it was like, oh yes, I could do that. So that opened up the floodgates, and she knows this. I've thanked her many times for that note saying, could you dance with your words? And so that's provided a much more permeability, flexibility, and honoring the primacy of play in my life, which I now pass on to others as well. So in a way, interdependency, embodiment, and play are core virtues, values that I seek to live out in my life and my relationships now.
I love that because how often, you must see it as well, but I see it all the time that when I've been working with people who've been through trauma, come out the other side, one thing that has become so disconnected is their capacity to have fun and to play. We've lost, it's almost like we've had to be so serious because of
Yes.
what we've gone through, that sense of responsibility and that not really wanting to be vulnerable. So we cut out that play and that fun. So now sounds like the perfect opportunity for us to have a little play.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and I'm going to put myself very vulnerably on the line. And I'd love to have you share what I could do, what could be a strategy for me and for all the listeners who have been through trauma or experiencing the vicarious trauma and are starting to think, oh, maybe I could
Do
learn
this.
something about
Yeah.
this. How can you help me? What can you teach me to
Be
do today?
delighted, Natalie. And just picking up on that joy aspect of play, Dr. Brené Brown, who I suspect many of your listeners would be familiar with her work.
Favorite vulnerability researcher,
Yes,
and I was biting my tongue not to say her before.
I'll name her as
I
one in
love
the
her.
room. But I was working on my stuff with vulnerability before she became public. So I'm just glad that she's there too and has become a face of that. But she talks about the importance of leaning into joy. And so
Yes.
I see that playfulness is about part of that. What I'm going to take us through, and for your listeners, just with that kind of caveat up front, if this feels uncomfortable for you, just let it go. And maybe now's not the time to do that, but to, again, honor listening to ourselves. And what I'm going to do is going to take you through what I use with actors and with lawyers have done this. If that helps give permission to some people who are listening to go, a lawyer wouldn't do that. I can say, actually,
They
I have a
do.
whole bunch of lawyers who do this. I'm going to take you through an activity, and then I'll tell you how you'll use this activity, perhaps at the beginning of a time where you're going to do some serious work, and then at the end of the time. So it's like a top and tail or a warm up and a cool down. So if you'd like to, and people listening at home, you can't see this, but we're going to extend our arm just ahead in front of us. And we're now just going to do nice, smooth movements with that hand and arm, wherever we like. There's no particular way we're going to go, but we're just doing nice, smooth movements. And now we're going to play with some jerky movements. So just letting that jerkiness, that awkwardness of our hand and arm do that jerkiness. And if your arm gets tired, you can swap over. And now we're going to do slow movements with our hand and arm. Slow movements. Just see how slow you can actually get with these movements. Now, fast movements, and you can really play with fast movements, that hand and arm. Okay, and now you're going to stop wherever your arm and hand are. And you'll notice you've got a bit of a shape there with your hand and arm. Without thinking about it, just change to a new shape with that hand and arm. And now change again and again. You're not letting yourself judge this, oh, this is not good enough or whatever. You're just making a shape and again and another shape. And now making contact with that hand and arm with part of your body. Just feel that connection to yourself. And now making contact with another part of your body in connection to yourself. Okay, so just take a breath in and let out a sigh. So those are the physical activities. So we'll just revisit that now. We can do fast, we can do slow, we can do smooth, we can do jerky, we can freeze and hold a shape, and we can make contact with a part of our body. So what I'd now encourage anyone who's just done those things is now put on a piece of instrumental music, not with words. We don't want to be distracted by what the words are saying. We just want instrumental music. Every instrumental music, you just feel like connecting with and going with. Put on that piece of music, close your eyes, and play with fast and slow, smooth and jerky, holding stillness, whatever you feel your body wants you to do in response or even counter to the music. And just do that 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. At the end of it, keep your eyes closed and just notice what that felt like. Particularly notice what you enjoyed. And you might then want to journal that down if you're by yourself. Journal that down, what you noticed, and particularly what you enjoyed. We're really good at going, oh, I didn't trust myself enough, or I got that wrong, I don't understand what you're trying to do. Let go of all that. What did you notice? What did you enjoy? Do that at the beginning of a whole lot of tasks. Then do it at the end. Now, you might use the same piece of music and just see what you do with it this time. Maybe you now feel the need for a different kind of music. And that has been a foundational tool. I've worked with actors because they have given permission for their body to do these hand dances. They might do 2 hands, they might even do a full body dance. And they do that as a warm up and a cool down. It's like establishing your ground of being as you before you take on the role. And then you return to just you and the music, and your body does the trick. The hand dance is one of the components of interplay. And as a registered interplayer, I'm allowed to be able to use those tools in my practice.
And it was funny, as I did that, I felt that sense of almost a rhythm and a flow going through me. And I feel even more grounded just sitting here now. So,
and that's without the music.
Nice. Yeah, and I didn't have the music on. So I'll add the music when I don't have people listening to my music, because it may not be what they like to hear.
Exactly, yeah. But giving yourself permission to give what your body is needing by the selection of the music you choose. So you might choose something that's very melodic and peaceful, or you might choose something that's really agitating and rocky kind of music. You know, different people, different needs, listening to the body, allowing the body. And that's why we avoid lyrics, because it brings in the left-hand side of the brain, I think, where we're using text and words.
Part, yep.
Yeah, and we want
rather than the analytic.
Yeah, we want to get into that, away from the analytic with words and so on.
Yeah, oh, that's really helpful. And I'm sure that our listeners will have really found that of great interest. And I'd love for them to send through some feedback.
Yes,
and
that would be lovely to see
how that felt for them.
Yeah.
And I think any practical tool like that can help them to separate from that past stuff or the old stuff or what else might be going on now, and just get grounded in the here and now and have some joy and play.
And it's really connected like to your joy.
Yes.
What brings you joy, which I think so. And so here we are feeding our innate self rather than prior to any identity we have in any role or whatever.
And no expectations and no judgment. It's just going with what we need and what our body and soul need, rather than what we think it needs. Because that cognitive level of conscious stuff just continues to shut off the unconscious level of what we know we need when we really truly listen to our own bodies. I love that. So tell me, do you think there's any specific qualities or personal attributes that you've noticed through your own lived experience, but also in the work that you're doing with all these people, helping professionals, actors, lawyers, in the work that you're doing? Anything you'd see as key for moving from trauma and into post-traumatic growth?
Yes, I think a key thing is one key thing is recognizing trauma is going to happen. So sorry about that.
Yep.
Anyone who's promising here's the solution to trauma-free whatever. No, I'm sorry. We live in a world that is vulnerable and is subject to not only to human crises, but just natural crises that can then impact and traumatize us as well. So I think, so that's when I've been writing around the work on, I say, when you experience this, these are the things you need to consider. However, given that's a given, if we are preparing our mind, heart and soul and body to be flexible and playful and compassionate around these things, I think sets us up rather than the kind of world where we're still believing that our professionals have to be heroes and then end up becoming martyrs.
Yes.
That's setting us up for failure and for prolonged trauma impacts, because if our identity is caught up in being the hero, being the martyr, we're working across purposes where we're trying to be this superhero, we're not feeling we can say no. We're not saying we do need boundaries. We do need rest. We need recovery time from trauma. We need time for healing. We need time for renewal. We need to both acclimatize. I use the metaphor of climbing for peak performance.
Yes.
And I think this applies not only to actors, but I think any professional who wants to strive for peak performance. That peak performance is a pretty rarefied existence where everything is working at peak condition and you're working at the top of your game. You can't sustain that for very long, and you can't live up there. And there's at times a bit of a buzz in living up there, which can be very attractive, maybe even addictive, I might propose.
Yes,
And that's where actors want to live up in the heights of performance. And when they have to confront the post-production blues, which you actually do call this in acting, post-performance blues, rather than own the discomfort and the pain and process that through hand dances and various things, they try to lift themselves back up into the buzz of the heights with self-medicating, or try and manage the depression with self-medicating. And this is where we end up with actors who are having issues with alcohol and other strategies. So we need to learn to acclimatize and then de-acclimatize. Again, I see body wisdom teaches us this. The body can adapt to more rarefied air when we're in our peak performance, but we really can't live up there. And most of our significant relationships are actually down here in the everyday of life. Actors need to know after their role, they're going to have to put out the washing or relate to their partner and their kids as themselves, or in their other roles as parent and so on. So we need skills to acclimatize and de-acclimatize that will, I believe, then enable us to manage the inevitable traumas that appear with the body's wisdom skills, and remember the relational resilience skills.
Exactly.
Or feed into this. So this, in fact, becomes an ecosystem. That's how I frame it, as a embodied vulnerability ecosystem that honors our vulnerability, our embodiedness, our interconnectedness, and our interdependency, and knows that we weren't meant to be these heroes come martyrs, but to be good, professional, human beings. I say to actors, you're not an actor, you're a human being who acts.
Exactly.
So you're not a doctor, you're a person who provides skills in healing. And in fact, the good doctors probably are the ones who say, actually, I just set up the healing environment for the body. The body is the thing that actually does the healing often. And that's with great respect to my doctors. So I saw a physio, and he knew his craft, and he could help me understand how I could partner with him in the healing of my knee. And so that was a great partnership, respecting his expertise. But I never put him on a pedestal, and he treated me as a partner, giving me the exercises to do. So together we achieved a good outcome. So I think it can be modeled that way.
Definitely. So that mutually respected embodied wisdom. So we embody the wisdom of the person in that position, but it's a mutual arrangement. So they also respect us and embody that with us, so that we're working together for this better outcome. Because as you said, given the way the world is these days, trauma is inevitable. And as you said, anyone who's lived through COVID knows that whole community experience
Yeah.
of trauma and how we did or didn't
Yeah.
manage that as well or as badly as we did. Regardless, it's that shared experience
Yeah.
and it's how we navigate that and are vulnerable and willing to embrace the feedback.
And this is where the
And
playfulness allows us to make those incremental steps back
yes.
to a new place so that we're not feeling the moment we have discomfort, we become hypervigilant and we run away again. And so many of our young actors who went through COVID as much younger people,
Mm,
we've found it very challenging to invite them to the same kind of level of appropriate risk taking
mm,
that a few years ago was quite comfortable for our students. They were already used to in life, having a bit of a
yes.
fall here, a bit of a miscommunication with the relationship there, and they lost that skill, that capacity. So we've had to
Mm,
find ways to help ease them back into that.
yeah. So as we move to wrapping the conversation
Mm,
up, I know that you're working on some amazing stuff at the moment and you've got a survey. So, where can our listeners find out more about you and find you online? But can you
yeah.
also share that of how our listeners can help you?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the best point of contact for me would be through my email address. So that's mc.seton@bigpond.com. And yes, you're right. I am currently doing a study on what I'm framing as in terms of this vulnerability. I'm avoiding using the word vulnerable and I'm talking about open-heartedness, open-hearted professionals. So there's a link that'll be provided here as a URL link and maybe as a QR code as well.
Yeah,
Would
put in the show
love,
notes.
yeah, great. So love anyone who identifies as an open-hearted professional, come vulnerable professional to participate in this survey. And then I will be sending to people who sign up to do the survey, if they provide their email address, a final report on my findings of what does it take to be resilient as open-hearted professionals. And I hope to have that report and indeed a webinar out in mid to late June. But to the survey, I'm closing off either towards the end of this week or early next week for people who want to participate. But if people want to find out more about how I'm providing supportive services in terms of identity, I have created a Your Professional Uniqueness tool, which I can
Hmm.
pass on to people, and then a larger program looking at embodied vulnerability ecosystem, which we've shared some of the things around that. So they're some of the ways that people can participate with me further if they're interested.
How exciting. Thank you for sharing that. And I would highly recommend that we, as many of our listeners as possible, really participate in that survey because there's so many of our listeners who are exactly what you said, open-hearted professionals. And I think the world needs us to be
Mm.
vulnerable and open ourselves to what happens when we do that. Because as you've beautifully showed us today, you've gone from, the absolute bottomless pit and
Mm.
managed to pull yourself out and are living an amazing life now.
Yes, indeed. It's a great life to be out of that black hole.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing I always like to ask my amazing guests at the end is what do you think your younger self would think of what you've achieved?
I think a sense of surprise and delight. So surprising that it's not the path I thought I was going, but actual delight in that it's a more profoundly, personally valuable, but also actually making a real contribution to society and to the world of human beings. So I'm just very excited to continue the journey I find myself in now. Yes, I think that's how we would look at that for me now.
Amazing. And really, that must be so validating
Mm.
to know you've come so far and that you are contributing in such an amazing way in the world. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today and your wisdom and that amazing exercise. I look forward to engaging in more joy. So thank you
Lovely.
for being on the show. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Natalie. Appreciate it.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you for joining me in this episode of Growing Tall Poppies. It is my deepest hope that today's episode may have inspired and empowered you to step fully into your post-traumatic growth so that you can have absolute clarity around who you are, what matters the most to you, and to assist you to release your negative emotions and regulate your nervous system so you can fully thrive. New episodes are published every Tuesday, and I hope you'll continue to join us as we explore both the strategies and the personal qualities required to fully live a life of post-traumatic growth and to thrive. So if it feels aligned to you and really resonates, then I invite you to hit subscribe, and it would mean the world to us if you could share this episode with others who you feel may benefit too. You may also find me on Instagram at Growing Tall Poppies and Facebook, Dr. Natalie Green. Remember, every moment is an opportunity to look for the lessons and to learn and increase your ability to live the life you desire and deserve. So for now, stay connected, stay inspired, stand tall like the tall poppy you are, and keep shining your light brightly in the world. Bye for now.